The inspiration of neuroscience into deep learning is from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
With a little bit of sprinkled in from the 80s and 90s, but not very much. And there's clearly so much more we understand about how the brain works that could be fed back into AI, probably relatively quickly, if the two fields talk to each other more. Most of them aren't going to know the distinction between a deep learning net and the brain.
Mm-hmm.
They're not surprised if I tell them that the brain is more complicated than a deep learning network.
This is Brain Inspired.
Moore's law is dead. Long live the brain. Not sure that has quite the right ring to it. Might have to work on that a little bit. Well, hello, brains. This is Paul Middlebrooks. Welcome to the show. This is the second half of my conversation with Brad Aimone, the neuromorphics and computer scientist with a history and a heart in neuroscience at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. I advise you to listen to the previous episode, episode 41, to better understand this one. This episode picks up right where the last one leaves off. In the first part of our conversation, we talked about neurogenesis deep learning. We also talked about Brad's whetstone method of sharpening deep neural networks until they are sharp enough to become spiking neural networks. And the neuromorphic computing workshop, NICE, that Brad runs every year. In this episode, we finish our conversation talking about neuromorphics and its relation to AI and neuroscience. And among other things, we talk about how our knowledge of brains could help the world of computing progress once Moore's law does take its final beautiful breath. Show notes are at braininspired.co/podcast/42. And here's the last little bit of my time with Brad Aimone. So one way to approach AI is whole brain emulation. Emulating as precisely as possible, as much as we know about the brain. Well, actually, whole brain emulation would be essentially downloading the entirety of the brain in some certain state that then you could, unfreeze and dynamically use in your hardware system or in your software system. What do you think the prospects are for whole brain emulation, and would we even want it? Because in neuromorphics, like there's this sort of give and take of, sorry to interrupt, but sort of give and take of how much of the brain do we want to use. Then, like you were talking about before, it's about solving problems. So, you have this little principle and then you can take it and run with it and not necessarily do it like brains do it, but use the abstract principle for your own inspiration to compute something that solves a problem, for instance. So would we even want to emulate whole brains, right? Or would we be limiting ourselves in some sense?
So I think that I'm skeptical of that direction. Mm-hmm. And I'm skeptical of that direction from my personal experience in doing large-scale models.
Yeah, okay.
And there are two reasons for my skepticism, especially as it relates to neuromorphic computing. So I built these large-scale models, and I had lots of fun doing it, and I learned a lot from it. So I'm not going to say that the value of large-scale models is not there, but I do think that as you build these models, inferring insight from those models ends up becoming as big or not, if not a bigger challenge than building the models themselves. Never mind the fact that collecting the right data from a brain to download it all into a simulation is going to be a very hard challenge biologically. If you had a whole brain, let's just say that someone gave you a whole brain on neuromorphic chips, and it had every connection and all the dynamics you needed to replicate a brain, mouse brain, say.
Yeah.
Then we're going to be where we are now in systems neuroscience of how do we interpret what's going on in that.
Right.
So I think just because you had all the data doesn't mean that we are theoretically mature enough to interpret all of that data. It's a little bit, I think, I'd almost say a controversial statement. So much of the Brain Initiative has been about collecting data.
Yeah.
And I think that is a necessary step. But I also think that our theoretical tools to interpret data at that scale are limited. So, I mean, I'd take the box and I'd start using it to develop the theoretical tools, but I don't think the box is going to solve you the problems of AI today. That box being the whole brain on a simulation. The second reason I'm skeptical of it from a neuromorphic point of view is that as I built really, really big simulations, I never once said to myself, I wish I had a neuromorphic chip to accelerate these simulations.
Wait,
because
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll restate that. So when I was building larger and larger scale biological simulations, so millions of spiking neurons from the hippocampus in silico, and I was running them on supercomputers, the sort of large HPC platforms that we have here at Sandia. And the thing that I learned was that the computing resources I had and that are increasingly available are sufficient for doing these really large simulations. Ultimately, you're going to have to pay a power bill or some cost where having neuromorphic accelerators would be useful. But for the most part, having a neuromorphic chip would not give me any capability, any sort of ability to do anything at a bigger scale than the tools I already have at my disposal.
I see.
We've gone a long way with exascale, petascale supercomputers. They're not easy to program, but neuromorphic chips aren't easy to program either. So I think that a good computer science simulation on conventional supercomputing resources can probably do all of the large scale simulations we probably need today. That's not to say neuromorphic doesn't have value to feed back into neuroscience. I think it absolutely does, but I don't think that value is just letting you have bigger and bigger simulations.
Well, that's what I was going to ask next. And, so there's a lot of push from, a lot of theoretical and computational neuroscientists who see the value in deep learning as being able to generate new theories to then push back into neuroscience and understand brains better by developing and analyzing these deep networks. And I was going to ask if you think that neuromorphics will help us understand brains, and if so, how?
So my personal hope, I'm a neuroscientist at heart, so I want to understand the brain as much as anybody else doing neuroscience. And the reason I justify taking this sort of diversion into computing is that I think that by thinking about how to solve problems using neurons, real world problems, things like maybe deep learning problems, but maybe think about how to solve a partial differential equation using neurons, which is something else we've been doing, or things that may not look anything like how the brain works. But by learning how to solve problems using neurons as the sort of logic gates, as the tools, and that is done with the intent of eventually putting those applications on neuromorphic chips. But thinking about solving problems in this way will provide us a different perspective by which we can look at how the brain solves problems. Because ultimately, the brain has at its disposal billions and billions of neurons that can be wired together to solve different tasks. And we really have very little foundational insight into what it means to wire together neurons to solve tasks. So if I want to just if I gave you 100 neurons and I said, build a Boolean circuit to add two numbers, the thing is, you can do that.
Right.
It's not what the brain does, but by understanding how those sort of Legos fit together in fairly small packages, in very small applications like that, I think that we can eventually build towards more and more complicated things that ultimately will start looking like how the brain does things. Because when you start having millions of neurons needing to connect to millions of other neurons, the brain is actually a very good template to start looking for those solutions. So I think that this sort of approach of doing basic computation with neurons will eventually wrap back to understanding how the brain works from a completely different direction.
It's interesting because people think of neural networks as being a bottom-up approach because you're emulating neurons by having individual units and then just using the statistical properties as it learns. But what you're talking about is more of a bottom-up approach almost, I'd say. And in the way that you're speaking about it, neural nets is almost a top-down approach because you're just throwing the computation. Well, you're feeding the answers to the network and just asking it to perform the work, which is almost top-down.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that I see a value in almost learning how to program neurons at the assembly code level, so to speak. And it's how do you wire neurons together to solve things? Which, if you look at the full spectrum of nervous systems, things like Drosophila and C. elegans, and even a number of mammalian subcircuits are more or less hardwired. I mean, they are not, it's not just a blank slate that we present a lot of data to and hope it learns during development. The architecture is very much present in almost all nervous systems. And then within that architecture, there's learning to kind of fine tune things. But the idea that the brain, we can go about the brain as just a blank slate that we just present a lot of data to and it's going to learn how to be a brain. I think that's clearly not what happens in actual biological nervous systems. So, and I'm not going out on a big limb there, but going from this direction where, I say, I want to solve this simple function with neurons, and I want to start building up from that into something more complex and more complex and more complex. I think that there is a lot of opportunity there, and we're just starting doing that sort of thing. But I do think that in that respect, the sort of neuromorphic view of computing will eventually feed back into how we understand the brain in kind of a unique way.
That sounds hopeful. I hope you're right. What do you think are a few of the main hurdles right now in neuromorphics that are in the way of neuromorphics taking over versus deep learning, for instance, or just progressing in general?
Well, I don't think neuromorphic computing and deep learning are orthogonal, right? I think that in some sense, neuromorphic computing, it's a hardware story first and foremost. And deep learning is a algorithm AI story. And I think that the neuromorphic field is going to be able to take advantage of deep learning success and find an application that'll get it to develop more. So I think in that sense, they're complementary to each other. I do think that brain-inspired algorithms as a whole, my personal view is that the biggest challenge they face is how do we get new insights from neuroscience into the computing field. So if you look at deep learning, which is clearly a success and arguably a success for neural-inspired AI, the inspiration of neuroscience into deep learning is from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
With a little bit of sprinkled in from the 80s and 90s, but not very much. And there's clearly so much more we understand about how the brain works that could be fed back into AI probably relatively quickly if the two fields talk to each other more. And I mean talk to each other more than just how do we use deep learning in neuroscience, or how do we show that the brain does deep learning? Like that sort of conversation, I think, is going to happen, but it's not necessarily what I'm talking about. What I think needs to happen is I think people who are educated, trained in neuroscience, need to take a hard, long look at what problems the AI field as a whole, not just the deep learning field, but AI as a whole, is struggling to solve. And, I think that neuroscience will have a lot to offer in terms of this sort of longer term, what comes next after deep learning sort of view. But the only way that neuroscience can have that is if neuroscience kind of meets halfway at least in that conversation.
Yeah.
And admittedly, it's hard. I mean,
it's hard.
Unless you do total immersion like I did, maybe people can do it, but you don't want that. You want people you want this sort of dialogue to exist at a healthier level that doesn't require people drop what they're doing. So I do think there's a lot of hope, but I do think that sort of interaction is going to be a challenge, and it applies to neuromorphic as well. I think people building chips based on how the brain is structured, they need to talk to people who actually know how the brain is structured, right? It's not, you can't get it by reading Wikipedia pages.
I love the anti-Wikipedia stance there. Nice. No, I completely agree. But it sounds like the consensus from people, again, who, speak at the NICE workshop that we talked about a few minutes ago. The consensus seems to be that neuromorphics won't replace like von Neumann type computers that we have these days, but instead, as we move forward, will complement them like when needed. Is that your take as well?
I think that's fair. I mean, there's a reason that classical computing approaches have dominated for 70, 80 years. They're very, very good at doing what they do, which is kind of implementing serial instructions, mostly mathematical sort of functions. And there's no reason why we would use a neuromorphic approach to do basic computing stuff like, balance your checkbook on Excel. You probably could, but I don't think you need to, and I don't think you'd want to. So I think that the view that we're going to have a more heterogeneous future of computing is increasingly being accepted by the broader community.
By the broader neuromorphic community?
Oh, I'd say everyone. I think computer scientists as a whole, we see this. I mean, people have CPUs and they have their GPUs to do deep learning training.
Yeah.
And people are working on other accelerators to do different things. And I think neuromorphic approaches are going to be something in that sort of category. You'll always have your CPU doing CPU stuff, but we'll be able to use the neuromorphic computing to do certain sorts of tasks very efficiently at very low power at very large scale.
Well, I mean, the CPUs, the von Neumann style computers, right? They always give me the same answer when I ask for a calculation, for instance, or when I balance my checkbook. Mm-hmm. Humans don't do that, for example. Neuromorphics tend to not do that as well. And so I had Anne Churchland on my show a couple episodes ago now. One of the things that she found in her study on decision making is that animals, in her case, mice, have these lapses in their decision making, where even though the answer seems pretty obvious, they'll still make the wrong decision, right? And her take is that this is a balance between exploration and exploitation, that animals still are trying to explore different options, different alternatives as a way of learning the environment. And she says that we would want AIs to have lapses like these, to always be exploring. And there's also this concept of bounded optimality developed and talked about by Stuart Russell, which says basically that a machine has this finite speed and memory and can do the best it can with what it has, right? Do you think this is an inherent compromise or even an essential element of something like eventual general AI? Is imperfection a computational and almost fundamental consequence of achieving general intelligence?
So I think I would agree that there's a very strong biological value of having imperfection in the sense that you were talking about it. Although I think the way you described it, it isn't really imperfection. It's just the task that's being optimized is not necessarily the task that one is observing.
Good point.
So, the trial and error, the explore and exploit sort of trade-off is trying to maximize performance over timescales that likely are far longer than an individual mouse training session and so forth. Because, ultimately the mouse brain doesn't really know why it's being strapped up and being recorded, right? And I think what you want in a general AI system or even a more, smaller ambition neuromorphic application is the ability to control that. So if I'm balancing a checkbook or if I'm navigating a self-driving car and, I'm trying to do something that has to be reliable at 99.9999%, I need to have the ability to tune to that. And I would say that our brains actually are pretty good at tuning to really high reliability if they need to be. The thing is that for a lot of what we do, we don't need to be.
Right.
We're willing to kind of loosen up that. And I would, in full speculation mode, I would say this is where things like neuromodulators like serotonin come into play.
Yeah.
Is actually fine tuning the sort of sharpness by which our computations are done. And in a neuromorphic algorithm sense, if I'm self-driving a car and I want to have a neuromorphic algorithm do the navigation, and I'm in a critical operational state, I have to get to the hospital very quickly for whatever reason, it's not a good time to do the explore phase. Just like, as a human, if you're late to work, it's not a good time to kind of, drive by and see if that donut shop down the street opened up.
Right. Or for example, like a stop sign. You wouldn't want a car to not pay attention at some point to a stop sign because it's exploring.
Exactly. There's some things that, a stop sign is high consequence for you to misinterpret.
I see them as recommendations, but we wouldn't want our self-driving cars to see them that way.
Probably not. Yeah, I think we'll engineer those to be more reliable.
Yes.
But so I do think the tuning of that is going to be critical. But I think, to get to your original question, absolutely an inherent ability to switch between exploring the world and exploiting the world is going to be critical for more sophisticated, intelligent computing.
Yeah.
General AI, if you will. Because I think that being very rigid comes with consequences itself.
Quote, "Machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do." End quote. That was Herbert Simon, pioneer of artificial intelligence, among other things, in 1965. So you recently published this paper, Neural Algorithms and Computing Beyond Moore's Law, and this is about scaling computing in general going forward. And I love this because it's essentially your speculations, your very educated speculations on how our knowledge from neuroscience could help computing moving forward. And in this paper, you talk about how you make the case that deep learning is just the beginning, really, and that, there's much more to come as we learn more about brains. And you think that learning about brains is the way to go forward, to develop new theoretical frameworks to drive AI forward. Mm-hmm. Why is Moore's Law dying?
So Moore's Law is funny because when I got here 8 years ago to Sandia, I knew what Moore's Law was because probably of like Intel commercials from when I was a kid, right? Moore's Law is great. We get faster and faster computers. Right?
Was that really in commercials?
Maybe. I feel like it was.
Okay.
But it's more of a marketing thing in some sense. It's a business observation. And this is one of the things I learned is that what Moore's Law is an economic story. It's that the computer industry, through a lot of work, was able to reduce the size of transistors every couple of years. Mm-hmm. And there was a huge industry committed to doing that process. Because it's a material science question, it's a lithography question, it's a engineering question. There are all these things that had to go into making a smaller transistor and then building a CPU or whatever hardware out of that smaller device. And a lot more than just the device sizes. So having silicon that would be 25 nanometers as opposed to 32 nanometers, that's part of it, but you have to figure out how to make wires small enough to do that, how to have communication fabrics and so forth. So this is the computer industry for the last 50 years. And the thing is that Moore's law is slowing down. There's a very simple reason for that, and that is that our transistors are starting to get to a finite number of atoms in width. These things are made out of silicon. They're silicon that has, certain impurities in it that allow it to be semiconductors. And as you start getting down to things that are maybe a few dozen silicon atoms in size, which is a few nanometers, you really can't go any smaller and still have a transistor that operates in the sort of functional way that that material is supposed to work. So that's just a pure physical observation, right? The physics of CMOS transistors, or kind of silicon transistors, just does not allow them to scale smaller and smaller indefinitely. Eventually you reach atomic scales and you can't do it any smaller.
Yeah.
And we're getting close. So the computer industry is freaking out, understandably, because this was, it's a lot of work and a lot of investment went into it, but every 2 years you're able to have a faster, cheaper thing to sell, which in turn allowed faster, better software, and an entire industry to just keep advancing at this timescale. It's kind of a miraculous thing, but we were able to do it, and it was fantastic. But we have to think beyond that now, because it's no longer, we can't assume that 2 years from now we're going to have twice as many transistors on a chip.
And where's that going to come from is the question. How are we going to move past this, I suppose, is the reason you wrote this paper, huh?
It is. And, it actually, a little anecdote, there was another workshop that out of Oak Ridge National Labs that a senior person at a big computing company was complaining. I mean, they were saying how we need some other scaling law. We need something to take over for Moore's law, because we literally have $1 trillion industry depending on this sort of scaling.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that the brain actually has this to offer. And it doesn't have it to offer in the same way. We're not, the brain's not going to give you a smaller device. It's not going to give you, an exponentially increasing number of neurons every 2 years, the way that we've had number of transistors every 2 years. But it's a different sort of scaling law, is what I more or less propose in this paper, which is that we're at a stage of neuroscience where we've developed a lot of tools where we can record more and more neurons. We can look at optical tools or electrical tools to measure, how neurons and systems behave. The genetic tools are amazing, but we still don't know a lot. And this was the theme earlier in our conversation. We don't know a lot about how the brain is working. So I see that as an opportunity. If we just keep going down this path of neuroscience, every 2 years, let's say, we're going to know more than we knew 2 years before. And then, or maybe it's 5 years or whatever time scale, but we're going to be increasing our neuroscience knowledge of how the brain actually works for generations to come. We're not 2 years away from understanding everything about the brain. I'd say we're at the beginning. Well, no, I think it's a good thing. I think that we're at a point where 2 years from now, we'll be able to go and we'll be able to see amazing, great results, but there'll be a reason to come back for more 2 years later. And a reason to come back for more 2 years later. We're at the beginning of a renaissance, and that sort of continual titration of the secrets of the brain into computing is an opportunity to effectively get the same results that Moore's law gave computing over the last number of decades.
So in the paper, and of course I'll point people to it, it's just this, we'll talk about the potential steps that you lay out. And these are the speculative sort of order of how brain knowledge will contribute to our computing power, essentially, going forward. One of the things you talk about is how neural computing could be one-off or paradigm shifting. And can you explain the difference between those and just the range of effects of those alternative possibilities?
So one possibility is if you had a neural computing influence on computing, which was just, we're going to use a new architecture. We're going to replace von Neumann architectures with neurons. wired up however you wanted to wire them up. And the argument was made to me once by someone who knew what they were talking about, that this would be disruptive, but once you do it, you can't benefit from it again and again and again, because It's like, I now have a Cortex on a chip as opposed to a von Neumann CPU on a chip. But once I figure out I have that, I'm not going to get Cortex 2.0, Cortex 3.0, Cortex 4.0 if I were to just replicate the architecture of the brain in that sense. So I think, and I think there's something to say for that. So it's not simply a case of mimicking the hardware. The hardware will give you some improvement, perhaps, hopefully. But I think there's a deeper question, which is, what is the actual computation? What is the brain actually doing? What is the sort of representations and transformations of those representations, the learning, all of the questions neuroscientists care about, all of those questions about how to do computing in a neural sense, that I think is a much longer influence on how we do computing for applications going forward. I don't know is that distinction clear?
Yeah, no, it's hard because since it's an audio podcast, I wish people could see this, the graph that I'm looking at from the paper, where essentially you have like Moore's law kind of asymptoting, and then there's this series of increases with these different advances in what we learn from brain science. So the first one, for instance, is feed-forward sensory processing, which is basically the big success that we have these days from these deep learning networks. And just to give a sense, each of these steps, there's this quick initial increase, and then there's kind of an asymptote. But then due to advances in our understanding of brains, there's this next step of a quick increase, and so on as we learn more about the brain.
Yeah, I understand your question a little better now. So one of the things that I learned from the electrical engineers is that Moore's law we saw as an exponential increase. But the community was doing kind of incremental things. They make a smaller transistor. The effect of that transistor would have a huge effect in a, over a 1 or 2 year period. And then the benefit of that particular technology would taper off, and they'd have to come up with a new technology that would basically bootstrap on the past advance to get something a little better. And so as consumers of computing, we would see what seemed to be an exponential increase as the computing engineering field. What they were seeing is a step ladder where it's, I'm going to do this technology, then this technology, then this technology, that yielded to the world this exponential appearing increase. And I would say that we have the opportunity to do the same thing in neuroscience, where deep learning, we're kind of seeing how there was this huge wave of deep learning where we were going from fairly abysmal performance on image processing tasks to something was more or less asymptotic when it comes to image classification. You're not going to get better than 99.9% on some of these tasks, obviously.
Right.
What we need to do is we need to take the next step to maybe something which is a different capability, a different function of brain inspiration. And so I kind of walk through a series of these, and it's speculation on my part, based on how I see the field moving, and maybe the order will be different at some, what actually happens. I don't know. But, I do think we're seeing evidence that early stages of some of these next possible technologies are already beginning to occur. We see it with things like recurrent neural networks, people who are looking to the brain for how, local inhibitory circuits feedback on excitatory circuits. That's a really trendy thing in neuroscience today, especially in cortex. And the deep learning field is kind of primed to take that knowledge to make their algorithms more temporal and have them have a more, say, temporally robust function in dealing with things like video processing and other sorts of tasks. And I think you can kind of walk through a trajectory of steps that neuroscience can add over the next coming decades.
Well, just for fun, let's do walk through it if you're game for it. So the first step is actually what's going on right now. It's these the success that's been going on. It's these feed-forward deep networks, which has already advanced the field, but still has, you make the point, still has a lot to learn from neuroscience, a lot to incorporate from, like you said, these concepts that has driven, these successes were basically from the 60s with some sprinkled in 70s and 80s knowledge from our brains.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot to learn from there. So then eventually we're going to incorporate more into these feed forward systems. And then this next step, like you were just speaking about, are the temporal aspect and the temporal neural networks. I don't know if you want to just elaborate on them.
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned things like inhibitory and excitatory networks and how our neurons in the cortex are connected in recurrent loops. They talk to one another. They're spiking, so information's encoded in the time regime. They're interacting with other layers, and when things happen is just as important as what happens in some respects. And so the deep learning field, or say the AI field as a whole, is only beginning to capture some of that in their thinking with things like long short-term memory networks and other recurrent nets. And some of those ideas have been around a while, but they don't really have the richness and the robustness that we see occurring in cortex. So even our sensory cortex, which was the first stage of this sort of trajectory, if you think of it feed forward, you can do basic image processing, for instance, or basic audio processing. If you think of it as temporal, when you have feedback and you have recurrence as you go through those, kind of through that hierarchy, I think that's probably going to be required for things like video processing and inferring things that are maybe more kind of motifs. You almost think of it as a trajectory of images over time or something like that.
Yeah.
Our brains clearly operate in a temporal mode. They're not static neural nets. They have this time dimension to them. And that seems, in a sense, like low-hanging fruit for the AI field to kind of embrace. It's a different technology, right? I mean, it took 50 years to go from orientation columns in V1 to what we see today in deep convolutional networks. So hopefully it takes less time than that for this stuff. But, I do think that's kind of the next thing we'll see is what I would anticipate.
The temporal neural networks. Okay. And then, of course, that's going to peter out in 10 years when we figured it all out and incorporated all that we know into those. And then Bayesian neural algorithms are going to take over. What's the story here?
So, this is what, when you go to a lot of the system neuroscience meetings, there's definitely this feel, and I'm not a cortex person, but I think the cortical neuroscience, systems neuroscience community has long looked at the brain, and I think rightly so, as having more of what we'd call a Bayesian sort of structure, where you have top-down sort of preconceptions of what's going to be experienced as a key guide and influence on what the sort of bottom-up or what is actually being observed. So the interpretation of sensory information is as much of a function of kind of an expectation of what you're supposed to see or expect to see at that moment, coupled with what's actually kind of raw information coming in. And that gives you a higher granularity, better inference of what's happening. So this, I think, is probably widely agreed upon among the systems neuroscience field. Now, the specifics of that would be, obviously depend quite a bit, on what research is going on.
Yeah.
So the mechanism of that is still unknown. But the sort of behavioral idea of that, I think, is widely accepted. The AI field, by and large, has not been able to leverage this sort of top-down interacting with bottom-up in training and inference mode of their neural nets. I think there's an interest, and everyone kind of sees a benefit of that. It's just not very clear how to get from where we are today in deep learning to something that has a much richer coupling of expectation and memory, in a sense, influencing what is inferred from inputs, from just the raw inputs.
Yeah.
So I think that's a case now where we're seeing that the neural net community definitely would like to go in this direction. And the neuroscience field has been thinking deeply about it for a long time, but we just do not have the sort of insights and mechanisms ready to translate yet. And hopefully those will come about in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, in all of these things, there is some preliminary work, and there's still a lot of potential to be done on all these little steps that were not little.
Oh, yeah. I mean, people are definitely trying all of these. I'm not making them up. So
yeah, no, it's not coming. It is speculation coming from a very educated background here. So that's the Bayesian neural algorithms that incorporates this almost sort of predictive coding, top-down approach here that's missing in deep nets. And then there's the next one is dynamical memory and control algorithms. What's this about?
So this is something where, if you look at what I think is really the exciting stuff out of neuroscience in the last 10 or 15 years, as we've been able to measure, hundreds, if not thousands of neurons in given regions, what we see is that there's a lot of structure in how these neurons interact in kind of a dynamical regime. So, people like to talk about sort of manifolds of activity and some of the buzzwords that are going on these days. But I think the way to think about it is that it's not a static representation or even kind of maybe a little small snippet of time that represents information in neurons, but rather you have collections of neurons that as a whole population represent fairly rich information about what a memory is or what motor control, how you want to move an arm, for instance, or how a decision should be made. And so a lot of the really nice work out of, say, Krishna Shenoy's group in Stanford, for instance, where you look at kind of motor cortex in primates and seeing how you have very large ensembles of neurons represent an intended motor action, but it's not like one neuron represents the action. It's rather this collection of neurons at some population level changing a kind of in coherence with one another to represent a movement. And I think we see that in decision circuits. We certainly see that in memory circuits, things like hippocampus and whatnot. So I think that's fairly far out for an AI point of view. Yeah. But I think it's something that we're starting to really observe empirically in the brain. And it's very kind of exciting to see coming out of neuroscience right now.
Okay, yeah, and as these sort of steps go on, the more speculative, the less we know about how it might develop and how we might move forward on it, obviously. But so the next step is multiple steps, sort of it's like the unknown future, essentially. And you talk about cognitive inference algorithms, self-organizing algorithms, and beyond.
Yeah. No, and I think this is where you start seeing all of this come together. The brain, we know, has dynamics and is doing coupling top-down and bottom-up inference and, is learning on the fly at many different time scales. It's doing all of this in every region at the same time. And we're nowhere close to that in any AI system today. But, we're starting to see people think about that, right? You see DeepMind, some of their really nice work on AlphaZero, where they actually have like systems, different neural systems interacting with one another at different timescales in order to solve some of these games. The models are relatively straightforward, fairly conventional, given the techniques that people use today. But the sort of system view of it, where you have a coupling of these different approaches working together to solve hard tasks, is exciting. And I think that as we are able to fill in the gaps more out of neuroscience, we can start seeing more impact in those fields.
This is great. So, I really encourage people to, we've really just scratched the surface, of what you talk about in the paper. Have you had a lot of interaction, a lot of feedback from people in the computing world? What do they in general think about advancement via neural inspiration?
So I wrote this paper for the computer science field. It was mostly because we hear a lot in neuroscience about kind of, hey, this great stuff happening in deep learning or whatever, right? We hear a lot of the buzzwords, but we often don't know what the details are. And the computer science field, they're in the opposite position. They hear a lot of, okay, here's a big finding out of, neuroscience. It came out in Science, and, the CNN.com article says that they figured out how the amygdala works or whatever. And clearly we haven't done that. And so I was trying to bring neuroscience in a more grounded way to the computer science field. And I think when I've talked to computer scientists, that's what they want. So the challenge is, they're not educated in biology. They're definitely not educated by and large in neuroscience. They know that they need to go in this direction or a new direction. And this one makes as much sense as any of them. But they don't have a roadmap. They don't know what's possible. They don't have a filter for what's real and what's fake.
Yeah.
They need a fake news censor on all of the pop stories out of the brain, right? So they think the computer science field is open to this, but with the caveat that they want real world impact at the same time. So what they want to see is that the brain, they think the brain is going to be something they have to worry about in the future. They don't think they need to worry about it today. They kind of want to know when they need to worry about it.
Mm.
Or they want to know that other people are doing that worrying for them. It's probably the better.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So, but they haven't been antagonistic toward it, or Moore's law ending deniers or something.
No. I think most computer scientists who are well-read in things like Moore's law, and it's certainly not all of them, but most who have paid attention to it acknowledge that novel directions are needed. Mm. And we should just look at the fact that, up until 10 years ago, neural networks were a niche technique within computer science.
Yeah.
And most computer scientists rolled their eyes if anyone said, I have a neural network to solve that.
Well, because there hadn't been that many successes in that niche yet either.
Yeah, there were a lot of big failures of that niche too. And so what happened was they started showing really big success, and the field kind of gravitated towards that.
Yeah.
I think that has made them open to neuroscience as a whole. Most of them aren't going to know the distinction between a deep learning net and the brain. Mm-hmm. They're not surprised if I tell them that the brain is more complicated than a deep learning network. But I think that, why they need to look beyond deep learning, they're open to that, and they kind of like the idea that there is more to come. But, it's far away from what they do, right? So yeah. I think they want help. They want the neuroscience field to kind of show them what it is they need to do.
So there's so much to learn, and learning takes time in so many different fields. And it's really difficult to be an expert in neuroscience and an expert in AI and an expert in computer science, for instance. So when I went to my undergraduate, there wasn't even a neuroscience undergraduate degree. That's changed since. Yeah. But, at the time, there were a bunch of biology degrees. None of them were even neuroscience. But now I find myself wondering, when will there be a degree that is basically a joint program of neuroscience / AI / computer science? When's that going to happen? And do we need it?
I think we need it for graduate school now. Mm. I benefited immensely by being part of a kind of experimental computational neuroscience program at UCSD that Terry Sinowski had started within the neurobiology graduate construct there. Mm. So my graduate degree was in computational neuroscience. It had elements of what we would call machine learning today, but it was mostly neuroscience with a more computational bent. And I think we need more of that. And I imagine more of that is starting in some of these more forward-looking university programs, probably as like specializations. For undergraduate, I don't know. Undergraduate degrees, you want one that there needs to be a real-world benefit of having that degree if someone does not go to graduate school.
Yeah, right.
And, we see more and more of that for neuroscience now, with especially, healthcare applications in neuroscience, and, even things like, finance and AI jobs. Someone who comes out of neuroscience with some programming skills, they can probably do well for themselves,
right,
as an undergrad. Like you say, these are complicated fields, and they're complicated for fairly deep theoretical reasons, especially at the intersection of neuroscience and computing. So undergraduates being exposed to both is invaluable, but whether that should be a degree or not, I think time will tell.
Just something to bring those, because right now what we have is a bunch of different people specialized in different areas. And I'm just envisioning somehow to bring the Renaissance person back in that realm almost,
Well, I think the thing that I would, in hindsight, that I would have done, if I knew what my career was going to be, which of course you don't.
Yeah.
But if I had known, I think fundamental theoretical computer science classes, at least as a grad student, probably would be very beneficial to anyone interested in systems or computational neuroscience. Because what theoretical computer science tells you, and I've learned since then, is that it really provides concrete foundations of what is and is not computable with what sorts of resources.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And the brain has to obey those laws. So there are certain things that, the brain solves very hard problems, but it has to solve them under the same sort of constraints that a von Neumann machine has to solve them, a Turing computation based machine has to solve. And I think that foundational theoretical insight is probably as important to a neuroscientist thinking about the computation of the brain as, say, a basic physics laws. Shannon information is probably as critical as understanding what diffusion is.
Yeah.
So I think that sense, bridging those fields, at least in a graduate program, and thinking about fundamentals of computation is very important.
So is that how if you had to start over, is that how you would proceed then?
What I would do is I would make sure to expose myself to that world.
Yeah.
A lot of what I think neuroscientists are struggling with are things that were basically struggled with by the computing field many years ago, just cast in a different way.
Yeah.
The computing field and the neuroscience field have stayed fairly distinct historically, because both have been very successful. There's a lot of physics that gets into neuroscience, but not a lot of computing that gets into neuroscience.
Yeah.
So I would have personally bridged those two more actively than I did.
What is something that you used to believe that you think now is naive?
One thing that I used to strongly believe in was the sort of power of large-scale simulations for kind of bridging the understanding gap of the brain.
I see.
So, because that's what I worked on. So of course you're kind of a de facto believer in what you work on. And I remember asking somebody, why don't you see more of this? Why don't you see people building biologically realistic models at large scale? Why I say I was naive is at the time, I was in a well-resourced lab as a graduate student with the freedom to do that. And what I see now and what I can really appreciate now is that both the data cost and the time cost of doing those sorts of studies is very risky for most researchers. So, I do believe that, if you look and say, pick a brain region, medial septum, right? Random brain region, there is a lot of anatomy and physiology literature and behavioral literature manipulating that brain region. There's enough literature out there to build a fairly strong model of almost any region. I could build one of the medial septum, but I'd have to commit 6 months of my life to it.
Yeah.
Or more. And I've done it before for another brain region, so it'd be faster for me. And the thing is that it's not a scalable approach. It's not really fair to tell grad students to commit their career to this.
Yeah.
Because they may not get anything out of it. We may not have the tools. We may not, in the end, may not have the right data for it. And so, a lot of people chase this dream of building the bigger and bigger simulation, or say that's a dream. And I think that you run the risk of ending up with a big bag of nothing at the end. I think I was lucky that we got good publishable results that influenced experiments. But, to do it over again, I don't know if it was a smart risk to take. And so I certainly was naive to think that that's what the field needed more of.
Yeah.
I don't think the sort of culture and resource structure for neuroscience is right for that, at least for today.
Do you think that deep learning is overblown?
No. Deep learning is making huge real-world impacts and will continue to do so.
It is step one in your steps of the paper that we talked about. So yeah.
I think it is just step one, though.
Yeah.
Right. I think that it's not. I don't think we put a bow around the brain and say it's done its thing on computing. Let's move on.
How do you? There is so much to keep up with. So many. I don't know how many papers are published each day, posted just on arXiv, for instance. How do you keep up with the this blistering pace of progress in the fields as diverse as you want to keep up with, like neuroscience and AI and neuromorphics?
It's hard. So I will say that within the neuromorphic field, it is small enough that I'm able to keep track of the right people and with the conferences that we're part of.
Yeah, that helps. Huh?
For neuroscience, I actually find Twitter to be a really good filter. Just a certain amount of Twitter buzz around a paper usually will attract my attention to it.
Sure.
Which is, 140 characters, or I guess 280 characters or less to sell a paper. I'm probably missing a lot, and I certainly am. But every once in a while, you see some real good nuggets come through, and that's probably the best filter I have. And I think similar for AI, the Twitterverse is probably the best.
It does seem like a lot of academics, and especially neuroscientists, seem to use Twitter in that same way.
Yeah, there's so much out there. Ideally, everyone would have more time to kind of just sit there and go through everything, but crowdsourcing probably is the most efficient way to do it.
What's something that you are 95% sure about?
I would say that I'll say I'm 95% sure of it, but it'll be a controversial statement.
Good.
Is that our ability to understand brain diseases, especially a number of the really hard to kind of identify molecular mechanisms, things like depression and schizophrenia and so forth, is going to require a deeper computational view of how the brain works. Like, I truly believe that these are diseases of computation, in a sense, of neural computation. And the only way that you're going to cure a disease of neural computation is if you understand the neural computation. I don't know if that's I don't think that's a universally agreed upon view. I'm pretty sure NIH does not fund things with that in mind.
Yeah.
But that would be, I do think that is the case.
So, Brad, you've spent so much time with me. I really appreciate all this time. I have one more question for you in just a second, but I'm going to say you're 3.5 hours away from Durango. When you're coming through, if you need I know you just had a well-deserved vacation. If you need another one, head this way. We'll go ski Purgatory. We'll run the Animas River. Just come on and take a break. My last question for you, given what I've seen on some of the nice workshop videos online, and given where you live in the country, how often do you wear ties with green chili peppers on them?
I have one tie with green chili peppers, and it probably only comes out during certain nice workshop meetings.
Letting people know where you stand on the green chilies. Huh?
You got to represent New Mexico. And it's green and red chilies. I think both are on the tie. And they're both fantastic additions to one's meal.
Everyone in the region loves the green chili. So there you go. Had to ask. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Brad.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. This has been fun.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.